Isn't it one of life's biggest ironies that to enjoy the things we love, we actually need to do them less? You might think it's the opposite, especially in today's modern society where we're constantly seeking more, but by the end of this video, I'm going to teach you why and how that statement will only lead to more misery. And it is just about everything to do with dopamine. Before we can understand why overconsumption just leads to more misery, we first need to understand what dopamine is. Dopamine is a neuromodulator and a neurotransmitter. You can think of a neuromodulator kind of like the teacher in a classroom, while neurotransmitters are like students talking to each other. Neuromodulators communicate to the whole body, while neurotransmitters tend to communicate amongst themselves. Many people think of dopamine solely as the feel-good neuromodulator/neurotransmitter, but it actually does more than that. Dopamine is also responsible for things like time perception and movement. This is why, on a very basic level, people with Parkinson's have trouble moving. It's because they have limited dopamine. Importantly, dopamine can be released from different pathways. These include the mesolimbic, which is responsible for motivation and connects to the forebrain, which is really important, and I'm going to talk about that later. And then you have the nigrostriatal pathway, which is the one responsible for movement. What these pathways' names are not actually all that important. What you need to know is that one of them deals with motivation and connects to the part of your brain that does thinking, and the other one is important for movement. Also, dopamine does not work alone. It has buddies like glutamate and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, which is why you tend to get that boost in energy when you get a dopamine boost. Now, let's get into the meat and potatoes. This is the really important stuff. Your body has something called its dopamine baseline. This is the amount of dopamine that's just regularly fluctuating all throughout your body. Importantly, dopamine is highly dynamic and it can have peaks above baseline and then troughs below baseline for any number of reasons throughout the day. If you're curious, the nerdy words for baseline and peaks is tonic and phasic release of dopamine, but that doesn't actually matter. More importantly, many different things can spike dopamine. Some of these things can be things that we need for survival, like eating when you're hungry or drinking when you're thirsty, or they could be things that give pleasure, like watching TV. Understanding peaks is essential to understanding dopamine, and one of the most important things you need to know about the peaks is that the trough always follows. So, when you get that peak in dopamine and you get that peak in pleasure, inevitably, you will actually get a trough that is below baseline. What this means is that pain is always close behind pleasure. Now let's put a real world example to this. Let's say I just really wanted to eat a whole pack of Oreos, and I just go and do it. Obviously, I'm going to get that huge dopamine spike, and while I'm eating those Oreos, I'm going to feel awesome. I'm going to be having so much fun. But then, remember, what goes up must come down. So after I finish those Oreos, eventually, I'm going to hit a trough. I'm going to hit that valley, I'm going to hit that low, and I'm going to feel just as much worse. If you were to look at this solely from the dopamine perspective and not from a nutrition standpoint, you could say the reason I feel so horrible after eating a pack of Oreos is because whatever peak you get, the fall is equivalent. So even though I felt super awesome eating those Oreos, I felt super awful, equivalently awful actually, after I finished eating those Oreos. You would think that after doing something you like, you'd be in a better mood, but with dopamine, it's actually oddly the opposite. And you might be thinking, why is my brain sabotaging me? Shouldn't doing things that make me happy, continue to make me happy? But you have to think about why the dopamine system exists in the first place. The dopamine system exists so that we stay alive. In caveman days, it would do things like get us to eat, get us to drink water, get us to reproduce, and the purpose of that trough was to get us to do it again. Let's say we went out foraging and we found a rabbit. Awesome. We eat the rabbit, we're super happy, we're feeling great. Now, we experience that dopamine peak from eating the rabbit, but that means we inevitably have to experience the dopamine trough. Now, once we experience that trough, we're just in a bad state of mind. We're unpleasant. So, what our brain is doing is saying, oh, you know what we do? We need to eat that rabbit again, and then we'll feel better. And it takes note of that. So, back in caveman days, dopamine was extremely advantageous. It got us to go foraging again. It got us to eat again. It got us to drink again. It got us to reproduce again. It got us to keep our species going. Now that you have a pretty good idea of this concept of peaks and troughs, something like post-achievement depression actually makes a lot of sense. You know, you'd think, like eating the pack of Oreos, that after you do something that really matters to you, that you really put your all into, you would feel better afterwards. But what usually happens? You feel worse. And now we understand that doing that activity invoked a big dopamine peak. And what comes after the peak? The trough, the fall. This is why after finishing a show you love so much, you kind of just feel empty inside. Or after winning a sports event that you thought really mattered to you, you start to realize that you don't really feel that great. It's because of that peak in dopamine followed by the drop below baseline. Remember, this drop below baseline is not a flaw in the system. It's not your brain working against you. It's your brain reminding you of doing things that you should be doing. It's doing the things that keep us alive and thriving as a species. And, as I'll tell you later, you can even shift dopamine and leverage it to work for you. Now, I keep talking about this, dopamine below baseline, so bad, so scary, but it almost always returns to baseline or very close to baseline in sometimes a matter of minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes even days, but typically it will return to baseline. But after it returns to baseline, your brain will have learned, it will have taken note of the series of events that led up to that dopamine spike. Remember, your brain loves dopamine, and dopamine wants more dopamine, because when you do things that give off dopamine, they're typically the things that keep you alive. And very importantly, I said that your dopamine levels will return close to baseline, because in certain scenarios, there's this very dangerous effect of dopamine baseline slipping, especially in addiction. And now I'm going to teach you the next very crucial idea you need to understand about dopamine. And that's that there's only a limited amount of dopamine at any given time. Your body has something called the readily releasable pool of dopamine, or pretty much how much dopamine you have. And you can think of dopamine a lot like a currency. The more you spend, the less you have to distribute throughout the day. So, what starts to happen when you do super stimulating dopamine invoking activities, like play a ton of video games or eat a pack of Oreos? Well, you surely do get that huge dopamine high, but now you've spent a lot of dopamine. There's just not that much dopamine left for your body to use for regular baseline circulation. So now you're riding lower than your previous baseline, and you're generally feeling worse, right? And when you feel worse, what do you want to do? You want to do that behavior again and get that big dopamine spike. And then you eat another pack of Oreos, and then it goes down even further. And you eat another pack of Oreos, and it goes down even a bit further. And you can see how, maybe not in the day, or I'm describing it much faster than it would actually happen, but you could see how after months and months and months of these behaviors, your dopamine baseline will drop to a very not great level, and you will not feel great. I am by no means an addiction expert, but this is why many people with addiction need to do the behavior they're addicted to simply to feel normal. They've spent all their dopamine doing that behavior, getting that high, and now their baseline is riding so low. So, to reach levels of their old original baseline, unaltered by the addiction behavior, they need to do that behavior just to even feel normal. So, let's make up an example here. Let's say every day you get 100 units of dopamine for your body to spend on tasks. So first thing in the morning, you wake up and you decide to scroll Instagram for 3 hours. Your body has, say, spent 50 dopamine units on that. Okay, well now you're experiencing the trough, but your body only has 50 units of dopamine left for the day to do things like study, exercise, eat healthy food, pursue relationships. You can see that 50 units of dopamine is probably not enough for that stuff. And that's why so many people struggle with motivation. They're experiencing these very, very, very large peaks, and they're getting these troughs and spending all their dopamine. In a very similar way, if you have a monthly budget and you spend half your money in the first week, well, now you have half your money to live for 3 weeks. And inevitably, you're going to have to make some cuts. You're gonna have to ride lower and spend less than you would if you had equally distributed your money. Now, another important aspect of dopamine is novelty. You simply will not be able to invoke the same dopamine response from the same thing and get the exact same high. So if we go back to the Oreo example, eventually a pack of Oreos just isn't gonna cut it. I'm not gonna be able to reach that same high eating only 1 pack of Oreos. I might have to start eating 1 1/4 pack of Oreos. And then time goes by, I keep eating ridiculous amounts of Oreos, and I need 1.5 packs of Oreos to get that high I used to get. But also, while you can build tolerance, you can also build sensitivity, right? So let's say after eating 1.5 packs of Oreos for a year straight, I went completely cold turkey for a month and I ate no Oreos. And then after that month, I ate an Oreo. God damn, it is going to evoke a lot of dopamine and it is going to taste so good. So now we're actually able to answer the question at the beginning of the video. Why is it that doing the things we love actually makes us enjoy them less? Well, it's for one, the tolerance of dopamine. Doing that same thing over and over again is no longer novel and it's no longer as exciting. It doesn't invoke as much dopamine. And then there's also this aspect of peaks and troughs and readily releasable pool of dopamine. Whenever we do that activity, we experience that high and then the low. And we don't really like the low that much. So what do? We do that activity again to get the high. And we only have so much dopamine to spend. So inevitably, what's going to happen is our new baseline after doing that activity that we were supposed to love so much is actually below our original baseline when we only rarely did that activity. Now, the final piece I think you need to understand to really wrap all this together is that dopamine is relative. Your past dopamine levels impact your current dopamine levels, which impact your future dopamine levels. So let's say, for example, you experienced a dopamine peak in the past. That means soon, if not in the present, you will be experiencing a dopamine trough, which means in the future, your levels will be returning to baseline. You can see how a lot of this is all interconnected and can affect each other. Another example of how past, present, and future dopamine levels all affect each other is the relative height of the spikes in dopamine. So let's say I really like burgers, and I like McDonald's burgers. Let's say I eat the best burger in the world, and I get a huge dopamine spike. And then I'm really happy, I ate the best burger in the world, but then I decide to go to McDonald's and eat a McDonald's burger. When I eat that McDonald's burger, it just is not going to taste nearly as good as it usually does. Why? Because my previous dopamine levels were so much higher. However, imagine this other scenario. I did not ever eat the world's best burger. I only went to McDonald's and ate a burger. That burger is going to taste significantly better than it would have if I ate the McDonald's burger after eating the world's best burger. It may seem like so far I've effectively spent the whole entire video saying do not spike your dopamine, but that is not actually what I am meaning to preach, and let me tell you why. Dopamine is a necessity. You have to experience those spikes. Dopamine is the reason you get out of bed in the morning. Dopamine is the reason you want to eat. Dopamine is even the reason that the muscle fibers in your forearm muscles can fire while you type pointless comments against people on the internet. It's very important. So don't get it twisted. Dopamine is not some evil, toxic chemical you need to excrete from your body. Dopamine is very much your friend. However, much like a wild horse, you need to tame it first. The point I'm trying to make is not to limit dopamine simply for the sake of limiting dopamine. The point I'm trying to make is that we should use our dopamine, or we should spend our dopamine on healthy behaviors. And we should be aware of how all behaviors affect our levels of dopamine. You could think of it like this. Let's say I wanted to eat a snack, and I go into my pantry and I see I have an apple and I also have a Pop-Tart. What I'm really saying is, when I say I want a snack, is I want energy. Well, both an apple and a Pop-Tart give me energy, but I don't think it's an unpopular opinion to say an apple is healthier than a Pop-Tart. And this goes back to the idea of dopamine being the body's universal currency for motivation. It does not actually matter what behavior you do. What you get is dopamine out. So whether it's from playing video games or whether it's from exercising, the dopamine is the same dopamine. Much like how dopamine is your body's universal currency system, the result of when I digested that Pop-Tart and apple is the same, carbohydrates. Because the molecule we get from doing good and bad behaviors is the same, that just means we need to use dopamine to fuel good behavior. We can do things like exercise, focus on our diet, focus on sleeping well, focus on self-reflection, or any meaningful pursuit, and we can use dopamine to reinforce in our head that those are good actions and that we should keep doing them because they release dopamine. Remember, dopamine wants more dopamine. Now, the broad category of activities and behaviors I would refer to as good is anything that falls under the umbrella of delayed gratification. Delayed gratification, much unlike its sibling, instant gratification, does not give you pleasure right away. It takes time for these changes to accumulate. However, with dopamine, we can actually learn to like the hard work we do from pursuing delayed gratification. And then you get the best of both worlds because you actually want to. Your brain wants you to do the things that make you better. So remember that dopamine really is not good or evil. It's much more how you use it. And you want to make it your friend because the same dopamine that turns you into a mindless Instagram reel scrolling zombie is the same dopamine that's going to turn you into the most jacked human alive. So do with that as you will. Before we move on to the practical takeaways, I want to take some time to review what we've talked about so far. The first thing we learned is that dopamine is released from two different pathways in the brain. One of them is responsible for motivation and it connects to our forebrain, which is responsible for thinking, and the other is responsible for movement. The second thing we learned is that dopamine is very dynamic and it's our body's universal currency for motivation. No matter how we get the dopamine spike, healthy or unhealthy, a fall and a trough will follow before levels return close to baseline. The evolutionary advantage of these falls below baseline was to get us to do that behavior again, which helped us survive by doing things like eating, drinking, and reproducing. Our body has a readily releasable pool of dopamine, which means that the amount of dopamine in the body is not infinite. We can only release so much at any given time. So, when you constantly have super high dopamine peaks, what's going to happen over time is your dopamine baseline will actually drop to a level below what it originally was because you simply have less dopamine to spend. Finally, we learned that dopamine is very relative. Your past levels of dopamine are going to impact your present level of dopamine, which is going to impact your future level of dopamine. Keeping all that in mind, here are my 5 suggestions that you can implement right now in order to increase your baseline motivation and just live a better life by leveraging dopamine. Number 1 is to avoid dopamine stacking. It's to do things in their naked form, so to speak, or to only do that one given task. And what happens when you do multiple things that evoke dopamine at once is you get a greater peak. And we just spent the whole video talking about how that greater peak will result in a greater trough. And also important for next time is that creating that bigger peak is going to create a bigger entry point of motivation or levels of dopamine needed to do that behavior again. So, in actuality, the best way to stay motivated to do a behavior is to do just the behavior. It's not to add anything else. While this may hurt your performance in the short run, it's actually going to keep you motivated in the long run, which is more important. There are many ways that you can avoid dopamine stacking, but here's an example of what it might look like. Let's say instead of going to your favorite restaurant for lunch and getting a super delicious, juicy burger with your favorite sauce and nice toasted white bun and all your favorite toppings, you make a burger at home with a whole wheat bun. And then once you let that digest for a couple hours, you go to the gym, but you skip your pre-workout and you don't listen to music in the gym. And if you're really good, you'll turn your phone completely off in the gym so that you aren't tempted to scroll. My second suggestion is to always do the hard work first. Remember that dopamine is relative. So if you spike your levels of dopamine before trying to engage in any kind of effort, it is going to be much harder to muster up any motivation to do that hard work because remember, now you're in the trough. And of course, the opposite is true as well. If you do something that you really don't like or that doesn't evoke any dopamine for you, and then you do something that does evoke dopamine for you, it's going to be perceived as much more enjoyable. This same idea is why it's so hard to focus on schoolwork, for example, after going on social media. You spent all your dopamine and you experienced that high from scrolling social media, and now you're in the trough, and it is much harder to focus on hard work like studying because there's just no more dopamine to evoke. Here's how I like to structure my days based on this principle. I do something that you can think of kind of like a front-heavy day. Basically what that means is that I push all my work to the beginning of the day, or just I put all my hard work before the fun work. So that means I pretty much wake up, I go to school, I do my homework, I eat dinner, and then I usually have some free time to do what I want. This way, sure, at the end of the day, I'm still spiking my dopamine, but I mean, you have to spike your dopamine at some point unless you want to live a boring ass life, right? And spiking my dopamine after I had finished all my work for the day is certainly significantly better than spiking it before the work, because then it would just be so much harder to focus. Alright, I'm gonna need everyone to think back a bit and remember where dopamine comes from. Remember that one of the pathways, the mesolimbic pathway, is connected to the forebrain. So what this means is that our perception can and does influence how much dopamine we release from things. This is why people who like to eat chocolate evoke a greater amount of dopamine when eating chocolate than people who don't like eating chocolate. So what does this mean in practice? It means that if you perceive what you are doing as something that is enjoyable or something that is good, you are more likely to evoke dopamine from it. This is one of the many reasons why gratitude is just so overpowered, because you are spending time thinking about how good that person is, or that thing is, or whatever it is you're grateful for is, and then the next time you go and see that person, or do that thing, or eat that food that you're very grateful for, it feels all the much better. Because your perception of things is connected to your neural circuitry, this means that mindset is actually extremely important. Remember that I said that if you think something is good, you can actually start to release dopamine from it. So, think of this. If you think hard work is good, and if you really think that it is, you will evoke dopamine from hard work. So, whenever you're doing something difficult and you start thinking to yourself, this is worth it, I love doing this is something that's important to me, you are actually training your brain to release dopamine from that difficult activity. So by leaning into that friction and that uncomfortableness, you are actually doing yourself a favor. This is the basis of the growth mindset. And once you achieve it in one area of life, say dieting or the gym or school or work, you can apply the same process and learn to apply it to all aspects of life. And that is seriously powerful. My fourth suggestion is to not spike dopamine before, during, or after any sort of hard work. And this is piggybacking off the last idea. In order to get your brain to like doing the hard work, it kind of has to be the most interesting part of that block of time. If you do nothing, then the hard work, and then nothing again, your brain's gonna be like, well, I guess hard work is better than nothing. So sure, stimulate that pathway, get some dopamine flowing, boom, get to do it again. You've probably noticed that this rule is kind of just an amalgamation of most of what I've said so far. Like I said in rule 1, spiking your dopamine during activities or stacking dopamine is not the way to go. Like I said in suggestion 2 or rule 2, whatever you want to call it, I pretty much said spiking dopamine before is harmful. And now I'm about to tell you spiking dopamine after is also actually harmful. Doing something solely for the reward is not going to get your brain to like doing the activity. It's going to get it to like the reward because that's when it gets all the dopamine. So when you don't get the reward, it's going to make that activity all the much harder. So actually, when you think you're helping yourself by giving yourself a reward, what you're actually doing is making the activity more difficult in the long run. My fifth suggestion is to keep big dopamine spikes on a non-habitual basis. What this means is you want to keep it random. You don't actually want to be able to tell or have any way of knowing when the next way you will experience a big dopamine spike is. And I know I've spent most of this video pretty much just saying, don't spike your dopamine spike bad because fall below baseline. But like I had previously hinted at, if you never spike your dopamine, life is just so boring. If we go back to the exercise example I gave in suggestion 1, caffeine and pre-workout and music, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of those things by themselves. The issue is when they're a crutch, right? If you cannot show up to the gym without caffeine or without music or without both, you have a problem. But no one's going to deny the fact that caffeine and music is going to make your workout more enjoyable. It's probably going to make you perform better. So, how do we enjoy the benefits of caffeine and music when working out, for example, while not making our baseline fall because we're constantly doing this behavior? Well, the trick is to keep it random. And the way I like to keep it random is I only save caffeine or music for when I'm really tired or when I'm really struggling and I really, really need that catalyst to get me going. Usually this might be once a week, sometimes 0 times a week, sometimes once a month even. And typically I'll only listen to music or do caffeine. I'll only do one of them. I only do both very rarely, maybe a couple times a year, and it sure is awesome. But again, remember, big dopamine peak, drop into the trough, less readily releasable pool of dopamine. I'm sure you've heard the cycle a million times by now. So by now, you should have a pretty good idea of how dopamine works, why it works, and how to leverage it to better your life. So let me end by saying this. There is a time and a place for dopamine spiking activities, and there is a slippery slope you can take in trying to maximize dopamine. If you're no longer visiting friends or no longer able to enjoy big family meals, or you're no longer enjoying any old hobbies simply for the sake of maintaining a dopamine baseline, then I suggest you seriously rethink your actions. I mean, sure, optimally, no one would ever spike their dopamine for any purpose besides hard, meaningful work. But, like I've alluded to several times now, that would lead to an extremely boring life with very little color. And beyond that, even if you understand the mechanisms and the general concept of dopamine peaks and troughs, that does not mean it is easy at all. In fact, it is very, very difficult. Sure, I can tell you all you need to do is stop big dopamine peaks, but that is much easier said than done. Even though I do consider myself to be more skilled in the niche of dopamine management, I guess if that's what you want to call it, I still find myself falling victim to the same traps I'm preaching against. I still find myself mindlessly scrolling Instagram. I still find myself opening up YouTube when I don't feel like doing homework. I am, unfortunately or fortunately, human like the rest of you. Again, I want to reinforce the idea that I do believe many activities we do in modern society are generally more dangerous than they are helpful for dopamine levels and well-being and motivation in general. But that does not mean you never have to do them again, or you just never get to enjoy life again. What I am saying is that you need to find your actual balance, a balance where you still have motivation to pursue things that are very important to you in life, while you could still enjoy other aspects of life. And on that note, I really hope this video served as a useful sort of intro to dopamine for you, and I hope you have a good day.